Judges 7, verses 1 through 23. God's way is the wisest way. Israel was in trouble. The Midianites had invaded their country. The Midianites were strong. They were mean. They destroyed the crops and animals that the Israelites had for food. They were big bullies, and there were a lot of them. Finally, after 7 years of being hungry and poor, God's people had prayed to God and asked for His help, and of course, God had a plan. God chose Gideon to lead an army that would make the Midianites leave. God had called Gideon a mighty man of valor, or a mighty warrior, and told him, "I will be with you." God had proven to Gideon that he would keep his promise to help win the battle. So now Gideon chose to be wise. He chose to believe what God said about him. He was ready to obey God all the way and do whatever God said to do to get rid of the Midianites. The Midianites and their allies had gathered an army of 135,000 to rob the Israelites of their crops and food. God had promised Gideon He would give him victory over them. Gideon called an army together. The enemy were camped in the valley of Jezreel, near the hill of Moreh. Gideon had 32,000 warriors from the nearby tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, who had gathered near the spring of Harod. They were outnumbered 10 to 1. The Midianites were camped in a valley nearby. Gideon's army waited for Gideon to tell them what to do next. That's when God told Gideon what to do. The Lord told Gideon, "You have too many warriors. If I let you defeat the Midianites, the Israelites will boast they did it themselves. Send home all those who are timid or afraid." So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. They were now outnumbered 35 to 1. Gideon must have wondered how you could ever have too many soldiers to fight against the powerful Midianites. But God wanted the Israelites to defeat the Midianites using God's power, not their own. So God sent home anyone who was afraid to fight. Now Gideon was left with just 10,000 soldiers. Then the Lord told Gideon, "There are still too many. Bring them down to the spring." At the spring, the Lord said, "Divide the men into 2 groups. In one, put all those who cup water in their hands and lap it up with their tongues like dogs. In the other group, put all those who kneel down and drink with their mouths in the stream." Only 300 of the men drank from their hands. God told Gideon that with these 300 men he would bring victory, and the others should be sent home. They were now outnumbered 450 to 1. God had told Gideon to send home every single soldier who got on his knees to drink. That was most of them. Gideon did just what God said, and then he counted his army. Only 300 men were left. God said, "With just these 300 men, I will save Israel." That night the Lord told Gideon, "If you're afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Phurah. Listen to what the Midianites are saying, and you will be greatly encouraged." Gideon and Phurah crept up on the enemy just as a man was telling his companion about a dream. "In my dream, a loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the Midianite camp. It hit a tent, turned it over, and knocked it flat." His companion answered, "Your dream can only mean God has given Gideon victory over us." Gideon bowed and worshipped God, then returned to his camp. Usually battles were fought during the daytime, but God helped Gideon trust God's surprising plan. Gideon was ready to obey God all the way, so Gideon began to wake his men, saying, "Arise, get up! For the Lord has delivered into your hand the host of Midian." God had given Gideon the battle plan, and now he told his soldiers what to do. This plan was very different from any kind of fighting they had ever heard about. He divided the 300 men into 3 groups and gave each man a ram's horn and a clay jar with a torch in it. He instructed them that as soon as they heard him blow his horn, they should do the same and shout, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon!" Just after the changing of the guard at midnight, Gideon's group of 100 men reached the edge of the Midianite camp. The Israelite army quietly circled all around the Midianite camp. Then, when Gideon gave the signal, the Israelites blew their trumpets. They smashed their jars. Their torches flared. The other groups did the same. They held the blazing torches in their left hands, their horns in their right hands, and shouted, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon!" Gideon and his men did not rush to attack. They stood back and watched. What a noise! With the torches, the trumpets, and the shouting, the Midianites must have thought that 1,000,000 soldiers were coming. The Midianites were so confused, they ran screaming from their camp. They began fighting each other with their swords. Those who were not killed fled back to the river Jordan. Gideon sent for the warriors of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh to chase them. He also sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim to cut the enemy off at the shallow river crossings. They kept chasing their enemies until they were chased out of Israel. Gideon had believed what God said. He had obeyed all the way, and of course, God did amazing things, which proves again that God knows how everything will work out. That's why God's way is the wisest way. Gideon did just what God asked him to do, and God won the battle for the Israelites. God wants us to obey him too. Obeying God shows that we're wise because God's way is the wisest way. Deuteronomy 11:1 says, "Therefore thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and keep his charge, and his statutes, and his judgments, and his commandments always." Statutes, judgment, and commands are big words, but they are all words for things God wants us to do, like telling the truth or being kind. What are other things you know God asks us to do? Yes, obeying our parents, praying, sharing with others. We are always wise to keep God's commands. When we read a book, we go to the bookmark to find where to start. A bookmark can remind us that the Bible is where we go to find wise ways to live. Remember, God's way is the wisest way. God's battle plan may have seemed silly to Gideon, but Gideon made up his mind he was going to trust God and obey no matter what. Because he did this, God showed his great power to everyone around. Jesus also made up his mind to trust God and follow his plan, no matter what. God's plan was a hard plan. Jesus had to die to be raised to life again. But because he did this, God showed the whole world that he has power to raise the dead and make anyone who believes in Jesus a member of his family. I hope you'll become a member of his family too. Remember, God's way is the wisest way.